Two clubs, two completely different philosophies, and one massive question. On one side, you've got FC Bayern Munich, a machine, ruthless, consistent, built to win, no matter who's on the pitch. And on the other, Paris Saint-Germain, star power, global attention, some of the biggest names football has ever seen. Now here's the crazy part. One of these clubs dominates year after year, and the other, despite all the talent in the world, still gets questioned when it matters most. So if you had to choose, which one is actually better? The system that guarantees success, or the super team built to take over the world? Because once you really break it down, this debate is a lot deeper than trophies. Let's settle it. Bayern Munich versus PSG. Club identity and philosophy. Before we compare trophies, players, or performances, we need to understand something more important: what these clubs actually are. Because FC Bayern Munich and Paris Saint-Germain aren't just different teams, they're built on completely different ideas. Let's start with Bayern Munich. Bayern is not just a football club, it's a system. Everything about Bayern is built around one thing: control and consistency. It doesn't matter who the manager is, it doesn't matter which players come and go, the identity stays the same. They dominate their league, they compete in Europe, and most importantly, they expect to win every single season. There's no rebuild phase at Bayern. There's no long period of transition. If something isn't working, it gets fixed quickly. Because the standard is always the same: win. And that mentality runs through the entire club, from the board to the players. Everyone understands the expectation, no excuses. Another key part of Bayern's identity is structure. They don't rely on one superstar to carry the team. They build balanced squads, strong in every position, clear roles, clear system. That's why, even when big players leave, Bayern doesn't collapse. They just replace them and keep going. It's like a machine. You can change parts, but the system keeps running. Now let's switch to PSG, because this is where the contrast becomes very clear. PSG is not built like a machine, it's built like a project. Ever since major investment came into the club, the goal has been very clear: become the biggest club in the world. And the way they've tried to do that? Star power, big names, global attention. We're talking about signing some of the most famous players in football, building teams that look unbelievable on paper, creating moments that grab headlines worldwide. And to be fair, it works, in terms of attention. PSG is one of the most talked about clubs in the world. But here's the difference. Attention is not the same as control. Where Bayern builds from structure, PSG often builds from individuals. The focus is less on a long-term system and more on assembling elite talent. And that creates a very different kind of identity. Because when things are going well, PSG can look unstoppable. The talent is insane. The attacking quality is world-class. But when things go wrong, there isn't always the same level of stability. Because systems are easier to rely on than individuals. And PSG has, at times, struggled to find that balance between star power and structure. Now, to be fair, this doesn't mean PSG doesn't have a system. They do. But it's not as deeply rooted as Bayern's. It changes more often, adapts more frequently, and sometimes lacks consistency. So when you compare both clubs at their core, it comes down to this. Bayern Munich equals system-driven success. PSG equals talent-driven ambition. One is built to guarantee performance over time. The other is built to reach the highest level through elite players. And neither approach is wrong. They just come with different strengths and different risks. Bayern's strength is stability. They rarely fall off. They stay competitive every season. PSG's strength is potential. At their best, they can compete with anyone, beat anyone, on any given day. But potential doesn't always equal consistency, and consistency is what builds long-term dominance. So now the question starts forming. Do you trust the system that delivers every year, or the team that can reach incredible heights, but not always predictably? Because this is just the foundation. We haven't even touched trophies yet. We haven't looked at European success. We haven't broken down performances in big moments. And that's where this debate starts to get even more interesting. Trophies and achievements. Now let's talk about something that no debate can ignore. Trophies. Because at the end of the day, football is about winning. You can have style, you can have stars, you can have hype. But if it doesn't translate into silverware, questions start getting asked. So let's start with FC Bayern Munich. And honestly, this is where Bayern immediately sets a very high standard. Bayern isn't just a successful club. It's one of the most successful clubs in football history. We're talking about dominance at every level. Domestically, in Germany, they've built something close to complete control. Season after season, they win the league. Not occasionally, not during good periods, consistently. And that kind of dominance is not easy, because when you win once, other teams chase you. When you win multiple times, everyone studies you. But Bayern keeps adapting, keeps improving, and keeps winning. But it's not just about domestic success, because some people might say, okay, but what about Europe? And this is where Bayern becomes even more impressive. They have multiple UEFA Champions League titles, not just one lucky run, not just one golden generation, but success across different eras, different players, different managers. That's important because it shows sustainability. It shows that Bayern doesn't depend on one group of players. The club itself is built to succeed. And when Bayern wins in Europe, they don't just scrape through. They dominate. They control games. They impose their style. One of the clearest examples of this was their dominant European campaign, where they didn't just win, they overpowered every team they faced. That kind of run doesn't happen by accident. It comes from structure, depth, and experience. Now let's switch to Paris Saint-Germain, and this is where the story changes. Domestically, PSG has also been very dominant. In France, they've won multiple league titles. They've built a level of control similar to Bayern in their own league. But here's the difference. PSG's dominance is relatively recent. It came after heavy investment, after building squads filled with top-level players. So while they win a lot domestically, it hasn't been over the same long period of history as Bayern. Now let's talk about Europe, because this is where PSG faces the biggest challenge in this comparison. Despite all the talent they've had, all the big names, all the expectations, PSG has struggled to consistently win at the highest European level. They've come close, they've had deep runs, they've reached major stages, but they haven't built that same legacy of winning the Champions League multiple times. And in football, that matters a lot. Because the Champions League is the ultimate test. It's where the best teams face each other, where tactics, mentality, and consistency all get pushed to the limit. And Bayern has proven multiple times that they can win at that level. PSG, not yet in the same way. Now, to be fair, PSG's situation is slightly different, because building a European winning team takes time. It's not just about buying talent, it's about building chemistry, experience, and identity. And PSG has been working toward that. They've improved, they've come closer, but in a direct comparison, they're still chasing what Bayern has already achieved. So when you look at trophies alone, the picture becomes clearer. Bayern Munich equals proven success across decades. PSG equals dominant domestically, still building European legacy. And that difference is huge, because consistency over time is what defines the biggest clubs. Not just winning once, but winning again and again and again. Now here's where the debate gets interesting, because trophies tell you what has happened, but they don't always tell you what will happen. PSG has the resources, the ambition, the talent. They have everything needed to eventually reach that level, but until they actually do it consistently, they remain a step behind in this category. And that's not criticism, that's just reality. Because Bayern has already proven they can handle pressure at the highest level. They've already built a culture of winning in Europe. PSG is still trying to fully establish that. So if we're judging purely on achievements, Bayern clearly takes this round. But this doesn't end the debate. Not even close. Because trophies are one part of the story. They show results, but they don't always show how those results happen. And sometimes, the real difference between teams shows up in big moments. Knockout games, high-pressure matches, situations where one mistake changes everything. And that's exactly where we're going next. Big game performances. Now let's talk about big games, knockout matches, Champions League nights, moments where one mistake, one goal, can change everything. This is where clubs are truly judged. Let's start with FC Bayern Munich, and one word describes them in these moments: reliable. When Bayern enters a big game, you usually know what you're going to get: structure, discipline, and a clear game plan. They don't panic easily. They don't lose control of matches quickly. Even under pressure, they stick to their identity, and that's a huge advantage, because in knockout football, chaos can destroy teams. But Bayern rarely becomes chaotic. They stay organized. Another key thing about Bayern in big games is their mentality. They don't play like underdogs. They play like a team that expects to win. That confidence shows in how they approach matches. They press high. They attack with purpose. They don't sit back and hope. And over the years, this approach has worked. They've beaten top teams consistently, handled pressure situations, and delivered performances when it matters most. Even when they lose, they usually go down fighting with a clear structure. You rarely see Bayern completely collapse in big moments. Now let's switch to Paris Saint-Germain, and this is where things become more complicated, because PSG in big games can look two completely different ways. At their best, they are incredible, fast, creative, dangerous from anywhere on the pitch. They can overwhelm teams with pure attacking quality. One moment of brilliance, and the entire game changes. But here's the issue. That level is not always consistent. There have been big games where PSG looks unstoppable, and others where they struggle to control the match. And this is where their identity becomes a factor. Because when your team is built heavily around individual talent, your performance can sometimes depend on individual moments. If everything clicks, PSG can beat anyone. But if things don't go perfectly, they can lose control quickly. That's the difference between a system-based team and a talent-based team. Bayern relies on structure, so even when things go wrong, they still have a foundation. PSG relies more on moments, so when those moments don't happen, the team can look less stable. Now, to be fair, PSG has improved in this area. Over the years, they've gained more experience in big competitions. They've learned from past mistakes, and they've had strong performances in major matches. But compared to Bayern, there's still a difference in consistency. Bayern approaches big games with a clear identity every time. PSG sometimes adapts depending on the situation, and that flexibility can be both a strength and a weakness. Because on one hand, it allows PSG to be unpredictable, but on the other, it can make them less stable under pressure. So when we compare both clubs in big games, it comes down to this. Bayern Munich equals structured, controlled, consistently strong. PSG equals explosive, unpredictable, but less consistent. One gives you reliability, the other gives you potential to produce moments of brilliance. And again, this brings us back to the same type of question. What do you trust more? A team that performs at a high level every time, or a team that can reach an even higher level, but not always? Because in knockout football, consistency is often the difference between winning and losing. And that's why Bayern has had more success over time. Not necessarily because they are always more talented, but because they are more stable. But that doesn't mean PSG can't compete, because when PSG hits their peak level, they can match anyone. And that's what makes them dangerous. You never know when that moment of brilliance will come, but when it does, it can change everything. So once again, we see the same pattern. Bayern equals control and consistency. PSG equals talent and unpredictability. And depending on how you see football, you might value one more than the other. But we're still not done, because now we need to go even deeper. Not just big games, but how these teams actually play on the pitch, play style, and tactical identity. Now we get into the part that really explains everything we've talked about so far. Because trophies, big games, consistency, they all come from one thing: how a team actually plays football. And when you watch FC Bayern Munich and Paris Saint-Germain, you immediately notice something. They don't just play differently, they are built on completely different football ideas. Let's start with Bayern Munich. Bayern's entire play style is based on control. When they have the ball, they don't rush. They don't panic. They move the ball with purpose. Short passes, smart positioning, constant movement. It might look simple, but it's actually very structured. Every player knows where they should be. Every movement is part of a bigger plan. They build attacks step by step, from the back line into midfield and then into the final third. And as they move forward, they slowly push the opponent back. That's how they control games, not just by attacking, but by deciding where the game is played. Now here's where Bayern becomes even more dangerous. When they lose the ball, most teams drop back. Bayern does the opposite. They press immediately. This is called high pressing, and Bayern is one of the best teams in the world at it. The idea is simple. Lose the ball leads to win it back as quickly as possible. And this creates constant pressure on the opponent because they don't get time to think. They don't get time to build attacks. They're always under pressure, always reacting. And when Bayern wins the ball back high up the pitch, they're already close to goal, which means quicker chances, more danger. Another big part of Bayern's system is width. They use the entire pitch. Wide players stretch the defense, which creates space in the middle, and once that space opens up, they attack it quickly. But again, everything connects back to structure. Even when Bayern attacks aggressively, it still feels controlled. Now let's switch to PSG, and this is where things feel completely different. PSG's playstyle is built around moments and individuality. They don't always focus on controlling the entire game. Instead, they focus on creating moments that can change the game instantly. When PSG attacks, it often feels faster, more direct, more explosive. They don't always build slowly from the back. Sometimes, it's just one pass forward, and suddenly they're attacking at full speed. And this is where PSG is most dangerous. In transition. When the opponent loses shape, when players are slightly out of position, PSG can punish that instantly. Because they have players who can turn a small opportunity into a big chance within seconds. Another key part of PSG's style is freedom. Their attacking players are not always locked into strict positions. They move around, drift into different areas, swap positions, create confusion for defenders. And this is where unpredictability comes in. Because when players have freedom, they can do things defenders don't expect. One moment they're wide, next moment they're central, next moment they're running in behind. And that makes PSG very difficult to read. But here's the trade-off. More freedom usually means less structure. And that can become a problem in certain games, especially against top teams. Because when things don't go perfectly, when the opponent is organized, PSG can sometimes struggle to control the game. Defensively, this becomes even more noticeable. Bayern defends as a unit. They press together, they move together, they stay compact. PSG, at times, can look more open. Because when players are focused on attacking freedom, they're not always in position defensively. And against strong teams, that can be exploited. Now, this doesn't mean PSG's style is worse. It just means it's different. Bayern wants to control every phase of the game. PSG is comfortable letting the game flow and then striking when the opportunity appears. So in simple terms, Bayern equals system-based football. PSG equals moment-based football. And this explains a lot. Why Bayern is more consistent, why PSG can be unpredictable. Because systems create stability. You know what you're going to get. Moments create magic, but they don't always happen at the same time. And that's the key difference. Bayern reduces risk. PSG accepts risk in exchange for higher potential reward. So now the question becomes, which approach is better? Over a full season, structured systems usually win, because they deliver consistent results. That's why Bayern dominates year after year. But in individual matches, especially knockout games, moments can decide everything. And that's where PSG becomes extremely dangerous. One moment of brilliance, and the entire game changes. So once again, we don't get a clear winner. We get a contrast. Control versus creativity. Structure versus freedom. Consistency versus explosiveness. And depending on how you see football, you might prefer one over the other. But we're almost at the final piece of the puzzle, because even the best system and the best talent mean nothing if they're not sustained over time. Consistency and long-term dominance. Now let's talk about something that separates big clubs from the biggest clubs in the world. Consistency. Because it's easy to have one great season, it's hard to stay at the top for 10. Let's start with FC Bayern Munich. And this is where Bayern really stands out. Bayern doesn't just win, they win regularly. Season after season, they are competing for titles. Season after season, they are in the later stages of major competitions. And most importantly, season after season, they meet expectations. That's not normal in football, because football changes constantly. Players leave, managers change, tactics evolve. But Bayern stays at the top, and that comes down to how the club is built. They don't rely on one generation, they don't depend on one superstar. They build systems that can adapt. When a key player leaves, they replace them. When something stops working, they fix it quickly. There's always a plan, always a structure behind decisions, and that's why Bayern rarely has a down period. Even their worst seasons are still competitive. They don't disappear from the top level, they stay there. And another important detail is how Bayern manages transitions. When older players start to decline, the club already has replacements lined up. You rarely see them scrambling to fix problems late. They prepare early, which keeps the cycle of success going without major drops. Now let's look at Paris Saint-Germain. And this is where things become more complex, because PSG has also been dominant, but in a different way. In their domestic league, they've been very successful, winning titles regularly, staying at the top in France. But their dominance hasn't been built over as long a period as Bayern's, and more importantly, their consistency in Europe has been less stable. There have been seasons where PSG looks like one of the best teams in the world. Everything clicks. The attack is unstoppable. The team feels complete. And then there are seasons where things don't go as planned, where performances drop, where the team struggles to find balance. That inconsistency is the key difference, because while PSG can reach very high levels, they haven't maintained that level every single season. And at the highest level of football, that matters a lot. Now, to be fair, PSG is still building. Their project is newer, their identity is still evolving, and they've been improving over time, learning from mistakes, getting closer to that top level. But compared to Bayern, they're still not at the same level of long-term stability. Another factor is how PSG handles pressure over multiple seasons. When expectations rise, consistency becomes even harder. And at times, PSG has struggled to maintain that same intensity year after year. So when we compare both clubs here, it becomes very clear. Bayern Munich equals long-term dominance. PSG equals high peaks but less consistency. One gives you reliability every season. The other gives you potential to reach incredible levels, but not always at the same time. And this connects back to everything we've already discussed. Bayern's system creates consistency. PSG's reliance on moments creates variation. Now here's the important question. What matters more in football? Is it better to be consistently excellent or occasionally unstoppable? Because both have value. A consistently strong team will win more over time. That's how leagues are dominated. That's how legacies are built. But a team that can reach an extremely high level can still win big trophies in short bursts, especially in knockout competitions. And that's why PSG is still dangerous, because even if they're not consistent every season, their peak level is high enough to beat anyone. But if we're judging overall dominance, across years, not just moments, then Bayern clearly has the advantage. They don't just reach the top, they stay there. And staying at the top is the hardest thing in football. So once again, the pattern continues. Bayern equals stability and sustained success. PSG equals potential and high-impact moments. And now, we've reached the final stage of this debate. We've looked at identity, trophies, big games, play style, consistency. Everything is on the table. Final verdict. So, after everything we've broken down, identity, trophies, big games, play style, consistency, we finally get to the question, who is actually better, FC Bayern Munich or Paris Saint-Germain? Now let's be honest, this isn't a debate about who is good. Both of these clubs are elite. Both can compete with the best in the world. Both have had incredible teams. But when you compare them across every category, a clear pattern starts to form. Let's start with Bayern. If you're building a club and you want consistency, structure, long-term success, and proven dominance in Europe, then Bayern Munich is the blueprint. Because Bayern doesn't just win once, they win over and over again, across different generations, different players, different managers. They don't depend on moments, they create systems that deliver results, and that's why they're always relevant, always competitive, always a threat. Now let's look at PSG. If you're building a club and you want star power, explosiveness, global attention, and the ability to produce moments of brilliance, then PSG becomes very attractive. Because at their best, they can be unstoppable. They can beat any team. They can turn games around in seconds. But here's the key difference. Bayern guarantees a level. PSG reaches a level, and that gap matters. Because in football, consistency usually wins over time. Now let's break it down simply. Trophies? Bayern leads, especially in Europe. Big games? Bayern is more reliable. Playstyle? Bayern is structured. PSG is unpredictable. Consistency? Bayern is clearly ahead. So when you look at the full picture, it becomes hard to argue against Bayern. Right now, overall, Bayern Munich is the better club. Not because PSG lacks quality, not because PSG lacks ambition, but because Bayern has already built what PSG is still trying to achieve. A system that wins consistently, a culture that demands success, and a history that proves it works. But here's the important part. This doesn't mean the gap can't close, because PSG has something very powerful: potential. They have the resources, the ambition, the ability to attract top players. And if they can combine that with a stronger system, a more stable identity, and consistent performances in Europe, this debate could look very different in the future. So instead of thinking of this as a final answer, think of it as a snapshot in time. Right now, Bayern equals proven greatness. PSG equals rising force. One has already built a legacy, the other is still building one. And that's what makes this comparison interesting, because it's not just about who's better today, it's about who can become better tomorrow. But as things stand, Bayern Munich takes it. Now the real question is, who are you picking? The machine that always delivers, or the project that could take over the future?